Hi everybody, Egypt through a geographer's eye, some signposts to avoid teaching a historical single story from me, Anthony Barlow at the University of Roehampton. So what's Egypt to you? It's probably a distant, maybe a far away, maybe an exotic, maybe a holiday location. And you may well have been to the pyramids at Giza and have seen camels, seen other tourists, and seen the hustle and the bustle of Cairo in the distance. Of course, that touristic eye view is often in great contrast to what people actually see on the ground. You may well have experienced that yourself if you've been anywhere near those specific pyramids near that great city of Cairo. And because there's tourism there, there's lots of the additionalities that you find when tourists need to go places. There's car parks, there's places to eat, there's places to spend time and to rest from that searing heat of Egypt. So what I'm going to talk through is some possible 6 questions on Egypt that you might wish to use to frame some lessons that you could consider if we're trying to move beyond this historical past 3 or 4, 5,000 year perspective on Egypt. So first we perhaps need to focus on the locational. So where actually is Egypt and which countries is it near? And some of the resources that I'll show you next, some of the maps will help you connect to those. And how is Egypt as a country connected as a modern country to the rest of the world? It's got 100 million people, many more people than the UK. So how does it connect to the rest of the Middle East, the rest of Europe, as it's got a coastline that connects to the Mediterranean? How does Egypt connect to the rest of the world? Where do people live today in Egypt? How do they live and why? And how is the land used in Egypt today? That's an important consideration for when we're teaching about Egypt. If we were going to Cairo, the capital city, where might you choose to purchase things? There'll be shopping centres, there'll be small corner shops, there'll be supermarkets. But if you were going to buy something special, where might you actually go if you were going to Cairo? What is life like for people, modern people, people today in Egypt, maybe for children? How is it different? How is it similar? Because it will be in many cases to our lives here in the UK or around the world. But essentially, Egypt, many of our eyes, is framed around the idea of being a tourist destination. But is this a destination for me? Is this the sort of place you'd like to visit? So I'm going to take a look at a specific location, a place you've probably never heard of, called Siwa, which is an urban oasis at the end. So it's often useful to start with a map. It's always important to describe where's where in terms of topography. And here's a great image from Digimap, and you can see there the main landmass of Egypt in brown, and then the Nile River, and then the Nile Delta, that very flooded grassland and savanna landscape where 95% of the people in Egypt actually live. That's a kind of population density map, again from Digimap, that really shows that vital artery flowing north, the Mediterranean. The Nile really does water and provide life for those 100 million people in Egypt. And then there's a political map, a map with all the locations on it, and you can see that pretty much along the Nile, there's various settlements, along with Cairo, the major settlement where the majority of people live, along with the coast of Alexandria as well, and a number of other smaller locations as well. But Siwa, we're going to look at later, is certainly an oasis far, far in the desert. But it's useful sometimes just to get some descriptions of how we might specifically describe where Egypt is. And Egypt is described as a transcontinental country, and it spans the northeast corner of Africa and southwest corner of Asia, by this land bridge formed by the Sinai Peninsula. Maybe you've heard of that, maybe you've not. So it's worth just kind of considering this top northeastern corner. Egypt, though, is a Mediterranean country bordered by the Gaza Strip and Israel to the northeast, to the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea to the east, Sudan to the south, very much in the news at the moment, and Libya to the west. And across the Gulf of Aqaba lies Jordan, across the Red Sea lies Saudi Arabia, and across the Mediterranean lies Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, although none share a land border with Egypt. So it's this kind of bigger perspective that you sometimes need to get. Egypt is a very specific country. There's a whole story there of those very straight, angular lines in northern Africa that we could perhaps talk about in a history lesson if we were going back a number of decades. But that's not what we're going to focus on today. We're just going to look at the Egypt and the story of Egypt through a geographer's eyes, but it's that kind of wider sense of scale, sense of perspective that we sometimes need to get when we're trying to build up a sense of where's where and where is it actually near within this kind of bridge between Europe and the Middle East, Europe and Asia. Another interesting description from an interesting book called Water on Sand that kind of describes the general landscapes in this part of the world. Much of the region is arid, dry, or semi-arid, and it's home to a wide variety actually of different ecologies. You've got plains in Turkey, Iran, and Syria. You've got mountain ranges in Morocco and Lebanon. You've got fertile river deltas, particularly in Egypt, but also in places like Iraq, alongside thick forests in Turkey and Lebanon and Iran. So again, single stories of these sorts of parts of the world through news images may not give that sense of physical geography of the natural landscapes that we can sometimes see, again, through some of the resources that I'm going to share today. So in summary then, Egypt is about 1 million square kilometers. It's 4 times bigger than the UK. It's desert, it's hot, it's got dry summers with moderate winters. What does it grow? Interestingly, sugarcane, sugar beet, wheat, maize, tomatoes, rice, potatoes, oranges, onions, and milk. And what does it send out to the rest of the world, according to the CIA World Factbook? Well, it's about petrol. It's about refined and crude petrol. It's about natural gas, fertilizer, and gold. So that comparison, that vital comparison that we perhaps need to compare where we are in the world, we are further north in terms of latitude. We have a temperate climate. We have these winds that come across the North Atlantic, and we have far more overcast days, as we know, compared to the kind of desert heat, the hot, dry summers and those moderate winters of Egypt. What do we grow? Similar things in many cases, along with rearing things like pork and beef and poultry. What do we send to the world? Interesting to compare and contrast there. We build things, we make things like cars, gas turbines. We also refine petrol from the sources that we've got, and also, according to the CIA World Factbook, we are noted for sending medicines around the world. So this sense that we are small, we've got 67 million people in the UK, and Egypt has 100 million people, and it's certainly 4 times as big in terms of land mass. Another thing that you could perhaps do to contend with what it is that you know about Africa, a really great worldview upgrader from the project from gapminder.org. You can do some quick quiz questions on different countries in Africa, in Northern Africa, in the whole of Africa. It's worth just having a look at that for your personal teacher knowledge if you want to grapple with how much you know about the politics, about the development. It's particularly framed around the Sustainable Development Goals. This are really quite useful. There's some good research carried out by a teacher in 2011 called Claire Kennedy in the Teaching Geography Journal from the Geographical Association. And in this, she imagines distant places with her pupils. She asks this particular inquiry question with them, where she says, Egypt, a rising star? You decide. So she tries to get beyond some of those single stories in terms of her teaching. But she started off by eliciting what they actually knew. And it was interesting that they drew some initial representations of Egypt through these window drawings. If you had a window into Egypt, what would you draw? What would you see? And it was particularly focused on the kind of touristic symbols of Egypt, the pyramids and the hot weather. And certainly in 50% of these, the kind of desert, the camels, the wildlife was included. But then there were some other themes as well. There was poverty, there was tourism, there was the religion, Islam, alongside the sense that there was a danger there. There was a sense that it was not perhaps for people like us, a sense that there was something different that happens in Egypt compared to the kind of familiarity of where we are. But it's interesting that there was no sense at all of the colonial past. It's only 70 years since Egypt has become a nation in its own right, governed by its own people. So Egypt, as has been described by Mitchell, has more often been imagined as this kind of historic, ancient treasure house, this alluring destination, that it's not been seen as a nation with a distinctive culture and territory that I'm trying to describe today, that you want to get over to the pupils in Key Stage 1 and 2. So these touristic stereotypes of Egypt, these single stories, obscure the contemporary realities, where actually there's a high socioeconomic inequality there. So just to kind of give you some more sense of place in terms of what we perhaps need to know, Egypt's official name is the Arab Republic of Egypt. The language is Arabic. Muslim faith is very, very strong. It's got an overcrowded, rapidly growing population in its urban locations. 95% of the people live along the Nile, as I've said. The land is desertified, it's desert. Only 7% inhabited. I mean, not much of the UK is inhabited if we think about where we actually live, but things like the rainfall is much, much less. And there's different parts of Egypt, just like there might be different parts of any country. And particularly it's described as Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. The sections are named this way because the Nile, of course, flows from the south to the north and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. In southern Egypt, the landscape has low mountains and desert, but in northern Egypt, it has wide valleys near the Nile and desert to the east and the west. And then in this river delta region, this Nile River Delta region, the land is completely covered, this fertile land watered by the Nile with farms. And that's from National Geographic. And also some perspectives here from the BBC as well. Egypt's an important anchor nation. It plays an important part in the Middle East. It's a place of note for countries around it, those that I mentioned already. But the great settlements, the great cities are concentrated along the banks of the Nile. But the economy, the way people work, the way people make money is particularly around tourism, growing things for domestic consumption and occasionally for sending abroad. But it also gets money from people who work and live in other countries and send money back to their home nation from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. But because of the limited amount of land where places can grow food, this is really causing a strain on the resources and these 107 million people that need to actually live there. So this independence of 1952 is worth considering. This richness that's brought by the Nile every year, by the annual Nile River flood, along with this isolation, has given this sense that it has this great civilization. But this is a civilization of 5,000 years plus. We need to give that sense, and that's where the history obviously interacts with the geography as well. But of course, how are we connected to the Suez Canal? Well, a lot of what we buy from China, a lot of what we use and consume that's come from parts of Asia will have come through this Suez Canal, which was particularly focused on in the news through the blocking of it by this enormous cruise ship, the Ever Given. And you may well have heard of that. And if you wanted to tap into that a little bit more, it's worth going into the BBC program called Why Ships Crash, worth looking into that, and because that shows how this very, very congested artery going through, as you can see there, the canal at Suez is so important. This kind of bridge between Asia, as I said, and Europe, and then going into the Mediterranean. You can see those cruise ships on the marine traffic side. It's worth also looking at other sites as well. You've got the Flight Radar 24 site there. That was just a snapshot of when I'm recording this, and the different planes taking off and landing, particularly from one location, particularly from Cairo. Other than that, there's just aircraft flying over Egypt. I love the WeatherSpark site to start to consider questions about what the climate is like in terms of Cairo, especially the contrast between the highs and the lows and the differences between different months there that you can see. So lots of discussion can come there about using their graphical understanding, their understanding of data, to ask questions and answer questions about the specifics of how Cairo is. A specific location and how that specific location is very, very contrasting to much further north, 52 degrees north latitude of London. Again, some good descriptive language here in terms of when it's comfortable place to be in Cairo, when there's clear cloud, when it's nice to be in the pool, nice to be by the beach, and when it's actually just sweltering, when it's actually muggy, an interesting term there used by WeatherSpark. I particularly like these images that you can find as well, sometimes a little bit difficult to grapple with. So you can see on the left and right hand side the hours of the day. So you can see pretty much 6 months of the year, it's cool at midnight. You can see there. But then certainly towards midday and late afternoon, it becomes sweltering for a good 4, 5, 6 months of the year there. So it's quite nice to, again, track different months of the year. When is it actually quite cool and comfortable? And when is it actually pretty much warm and sweltering and hot all day? So lots of questions could come from graphical description, graphical questions that could come from this set of data that you can pull off quite easily from WeatherSpark online. And then, of course, comes the contrast. If you look at this and then you look at London, wow, what a contrast. What a contrast between the average temperatures in London. Again, if it's February and midnight, what is the weather like? If it's September at midday, what's the weather like? So you can come up with lots of dialogue through these different tools that we could have a look through. But of course, we shouldn't forget that sometimes a specific year, like last year, is a bit of an outlier, or maybe an indication of a trend that's getting worse and worse. The fact that we have sweltering heat, certainly we did in parts of London, 30, 35, 40-degree heat. So it's worth comparing that kind of average over a number of years with the actual high points that we actually do reach at certain times, where it actually gets very cold and frigid and freezing, but also hot and sweltering during quite a number of different months this last year, 2022. So when we're teaching geography, we need to try and teach about the everyday, the quotidian, the kind of personal geographic sense that you might have if you were living there. Maybe you live with your family in a flat like this in the center of Cairo, this overcrowded, this bustling city of tens of millions of people. Maybe you're this individual called Hassan who lives in Egypt. Hassan lives with his family. Hassan is a homeowner. Hassan has this life, eats this food, wears these clothes. This is from the Dollar Street website from the Gapminder project. There's one specific family, Hassan's family, the home of Hassan, that's featured. But again, it gives you lots to think about in terms of comparing and contrasting the difference, but also the similarity between the life of an Egyptian today, the life of an average person, and the life of people where you're teaching as well. So really great to look at these images and to look at the street view short videos on here for there or around the world. So it's great to see these other images, these contrasting images of the Nile running through Cairo, the Nile that's been canalized, big concrete sides to it, the bridges over it, the prevalence of green spaces and parks, the importance of some of the economic development that's occurred there, some of the big high-rise buildings, some of the multinational brands that you find, and the importance of places of worship as well, that mosque there. So lots of things that you can connect to through images like this, alongside the everyday images of palm trees in the city, of places to park, places that people live, places that people shop, the hustle and the bustle, and the different street scenes that you'll see here compared to places that you'll be teaching about or be contrasting to, given the other locations that the pupils have studied. And one specific location you might choose to study is the Cairo Friday Market. It's a bustling affair that's several kilometers long. It's by one of the oldest and largest cemeteries. And this is a description from somebody who went from the British Museum and wanted to try and give a sense of the modern day and wanted to try and find an artifact that might well sum up what the modern day experience would be of somebody going to this market. What would you pick up if you went to this market? What can you see in this market? What's being bought? What's being sold? And it was interesting that this particular individual from the British Museum, collecting for this kind of national collection of objects, and they decided to pick up a minty green sewing machine because it tells an interesting story that you can find on the British Museum website about Egypt changing over the last 70 years, Egypt transforming into a much more modern and bustling and growing society. And this is the actual sewing machine. So it's worth going on the British Museum website to having a look to see how this sits alongside some of the great objects from 4,000, 5,000 years ago that you'll find in the British Museum that tell the story of the ancient Egyptians that we're trying to contrast with a modern Egyptian as well. So just to conclude, I want to look at somewhere specific. I want to go away from this kind of Nile River delta, this Nile River corridor, winding its way towards the Mediterranean, providing this really green, lush delta. I want to go to somewhere in the desert, somewhere natural, this natural urban oasis. You might have heard of the term oasis before, but this specific one is quite interesting because it's 19 meters below the level of the sea. It's a very deep depression and was very isolated until this road was cut to it in the 1980s. It's a very traditional religious area with lots of cultural traditions that you could look into with the children. It's quite indicative of the sorts of small settled communities that have survived in the desert for millennia, and there's a great historical perspective here that you could tap into as well. And there are hot springs there. They grow date palms, they grow olives. They're very self-sufficient, but they're changing these areas because they're bringing in development from newer hotels and spas, and they also export salt, and there are salt lakes there as well. So it's worth looking into these specific locations, which do give that contrast to the hustle and the bustle. We're looking at Egypt in general. We're also trying to look at somewhere very specific and detailed as well that's interesting. And this is an aerial photograph of this naturally occurring groundwater lake, which has some problems because this water is a non-renewable resource, probably. The water level will rise and fall, but it will certainly not be there forever if it keeps being extracted, if it keeps being used for the locality, keeps being used for growing different things there. Just some quite interesting images there from Wikipedia, alongside many others that you might choose to have a look at about the panoramic view of this particular location in the desert. And just finally, some things that you might want to consider if you're trying to give this kind of broad view of Egypt today. There's this natural perspective, this natural landscape perspective as well. A number of different creatures there that you might choose to focus on. Alongside many of the protected regions, we need to think about national and natural areas, national parks and natural areas, because alongside oases, there are mountain areas, there are coastal areas, there are river islands and wetlands. There'll be lots of interesting birds there as well, alongside the oases as well. Egyptians have been said by the National Geographic to be always close to the natural world. And if we tie into what the Egyptians said in terms of what they left as their paintings and their carvings, animals, elephants, hippos, leopards, and cheetahs were really important in the paintings that they have left behind. But now these, of course, have been hunted to extinction. They're now rare because of the habitat loss and the hunting that maybe they've been subjected to. So there's this sense of change and growth and development, but also loss, like we see in so much of the world, so much of the natural landscapes that we see around the world. But some of them still do exist. And this is quite a nice site from Eco Egypt, of the sorts of places that you can visit. And these are all Google Maps linked, some of the specific landscapes, some of the geology that you might want to see alongside some of the historic religious places as well, like St. Catherine and Mount Catherine as well. So I hope that was useful to give an insight into how you might broaden and deepen and develop some thinking on Egypt. So just to kind of recap the different lessons that I'm suggesting that you might want to teach and look at. where Egypt is and where it's near. How is Egypt connected to the world? Where do people live today in Egypt and why? What could you find on land in Egypt today? If you went to this capital city of Cairo, what might you buy? What could life be like for people in Egypt, and how is it different and similar? And as a tourist, would Egypt be a destination for you? Could you go to somewhere like Siwa?